My name is Lauren Draper. I'm the Middle East Fellow at Churches for Middle East Peace, and we are co-sponsoring this event with Embrace the Middle East and the Episcopal Church. So we're so grateful that you're here. This series of conversations with Middle East Christians has been a so we're enjoying our Dr. McCott has fireworks going in his background, so it's a bit of a scary noise, but it's a celebration, I promise. And so today we're going to be hearing from Reverend Dr. Rima Nasrallah and also Dr. Martin Akkad, who are coming to us from Beirut. And so we will get started right now. Oh, I wanted to say we're going to have a speaking portion where we'll hear from both, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. So if you have any questions throughout the course of the next 40 minutes, please use the Q&A feature down in the bottom toolbar to ask those questions instead of using the chat. So we're so grateful that you're here, and we're really looking forward to hearing from these two. So I hand it over to you, Reverend Chapman. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Lauren. It's a very special pleasure for me to be introducing two friends and colleagues in Lebanon, people that I've known for many years. I'd like first to introduce Martin, Dr. Martin Akkad, and instead of me trying to give you his CV, his resume, I'd like to ask Martin if he would introduce himself and tell us something of the story of his life. So, tfaddal, Martin, it's all yours.
Thank you, Colin. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be with everyone. Looking at the list of participants, I know a few people, which is nice. You know yourselves, and so very happy to see this group of people. It is the feast of the Virgin Mary here in Lebanon, so that would explain the firecrackers if you hear them from time to time. If it gets too loud, I'll mute myself for a few seconds. So I grew up in Lebanon, and the most formative years of my life were during the Civil War between 1975 and 1990. I come from a mixed background where my father was Lebanese and my mother was Swiss, so I have a mixed cultural background. But both my parents insisted on staying in Lebanon throughout the Civil War on the assumption that if the people of God leave in times of trouble, who will stay? So this seems appropriate to mention in these days. I then went to the Near East School of Theology to study for my undergraduate theology degree. And then after 4 years there, I went to the UK, and I was in the UK between 1996 and 2001, where I did a master's in Eastern Christianity and then my DPhil in Islamics and the history of Christian-Muslim relations mainly. I would describe myself as a historian of ideas, particularly in the dialogue between Christians and Muslims. I happened to defend my dissertation on 9/11, or 11th of September 2001, and the world was being transformed, and the Muslims had always been there, but suddenly it became impossible not to be aware that they were there for most of the people around the world. I returned in 2001 to Lebanon and immediately felt that I was somewhere like an interpreter between East and West, Christianity and Islam, and I think my background with a mixed culture, as well as growing up in a very mixed social environment in Beirut, as well as seeing both the blessing but also the lethal impact of religion and the mixing of religion and politics. All of these factors contributed to who I am today and my ministry and my calling. I worked at the Arab Baptist Theological Seminary as soon as I came back in 2001, I began working there, and I led the academic affairs, or chief academic officer for about 19 years at ABTS, as well as taught Islamic studies and Christian-Muslim relations. About 3 years ago, as the country of Lebanon was collapsing at many levels, which we will be talking about tonight, I felt that a very strong calling to move into something new. I've always felt maybe that God was calling me to at least try and have an impact wherever I am, and as everything was disintegrating, I felt that I needed to move and interact more with social activists, political activists. So I resigned from ABTS. I now continue to teach both at ABTS and now also at the Neri School of Theology, courses in Islamic studies and Christian-Muslim relations. But then I went on to start a new research center called Action Research Associates. And we have two areas of focus. And the first one is studying movements of change in Lebanon, and looking at socio-political change and how it's taking place, and people movement. The second track is working on the history of Lebanon. Lebanon has a long history of conflict, but we've also mastered putting everything under the carpet and trying not to talk about history as much as we can as a nation. And so one of our main projects that we're working on is looking at events from the Lebanese Civil War from a multiple narrative perspective in view of dialogue and reconciliation at the national level. So this is where I am today. This is who I am today, and I'm happy to share more as this evening moves forward.
Thank you, Martin. But before we ask you more about your own research and your projects, can you describe something about the general situation in Lebanon at the present time? Many of our folk who are with us this evening will know something about Israel-Palestine, and some may know a lot about Egypt, but maybe some people are less familiar with Lebanon. So how would you help us to understand the difficult situation that you're in today, the politics, the economics, whatever you think is relevant to help us to understand?
Well, maybe it's important to remind ourselves that the world overall has been through quite a significant crisis with COVID, and I think there's been a sense of a common tragedy globally. But in Lebanon, in addition to this crisis, which was quite strongly felt in itself, we've gone through multiple other crises over the past 3 years. And so I would describe the current situation first, if you think about, well, first there is an economic and financial collapse. So the disintegration of our financial and economic system, and that's didn't simply occur overnight. It resulted from more than 30 years of bad leadership, of deep corruption. Our political class functions more like a cartel than like political leaders. Every income-generating sector in Lebanon, such as the port, the airport, the electricity company, the water sector, everything is divided broadly among 6 political leaders and their communities. So I describe these as 6 cartels, but instead of dividing a city into neighborhoods, they've divided all of the income-generating sectors between them. You have a mix of senior and junior beneficiaries among these, but basically that's how it works. And so over the more than 30 years now, the country's resources have been completely sucked dry, and Lebanon has now become a collapsed state. The banking sector has collapsed, or is nearly completely collapsing. The Lebanese pound has completely devaluated. It's been terrible. Another area of disintegration is political. I've grown up, I've lived in Lebanon all my life, and the deep rift that I see today between completely different and conflicting visions of Lebanon's identity and future between different communities in Lebanon is very striking. Increasingly, many parties are now speaking of dividing the country into federal regions, where each can build the Lebanon that fits their vision. The problem is a solution like that is not going to resolve the corruption, is not going to resolve either the tribal political bickering between different leaders, including within the Christian community and within the Sunni community and within the Shiite community and so on. So the solutions proposed are only ways of escaping the reality of the problem. There's also a security breakdown. So increasingly there are regular incidents of violence, assassinations, rising crime rates. Increasingly you have conflicting political discourses with underlying threats, accusations between different parties. The Syrian refugee crisis also contributes to that. It continues to be used both as an excuse for incompetence in leadership, but refugees also themselves are ideal scapegoats for all of our national woes. On October 17, 2019, a movement of change emerged that raised much of the hope for change, but the political class has mastered the technique of crowd management, and their main strategy has been simply do nothing. And as a result, paralysis is protracted. Those who would have the skills to bring change leave the country en masse, and we're left with the status quo. You may have heard also of the more dramatic event now in 3 years ago on the 4th of August, where half of our city of Beirut nearly half was destroyed by the Beirut port explosion, which was one of the most clear manifestations of decades of corruption. The port as one of the sectors that one of the most lucrative sectors has been basically a place of crime and corruption, and over years of keeping this ammonium nitrate in the port. Nobody did anything about it, and finally it blew up in everybody's face. I don't know if this kind of describes the terrible situation in which we're in. I'm happy to answer more specifics.
And just to be very practical, how do you withdraw money from the bank if you're able to at all?
The answer to that question has evolved over the past months. At the beginning, we went through over a year, maybe 2 years, where it was practically impossible to draw any money. But the most significant thing that happened is that all of our money that was in the banks, in savings accounts, in retirement plans, education funds, all of that was basically cancelled almost. It was stolen by the banking sector and all of its cronies. Lebanon has had a U.S.-based economy, U.S. dollar-based economy for years now. And so most Lebanese had U.S. dollar accounts, savings. And overnight, the banking sector decided, and the central bank decided, that we were not allowed anymore to withdraw that money. And gradually they started allowing us to withdraw the money, but at a very, very lower rate than the reality on the market. And so basically, as the need of the population has increased, they have been simply withdrawing from lifelong savings at a fraction of its real value. We're talking less than 10% of its real value. And that is in fact buying out the banking sector, because we are withdrawing from our accounts money that's costing them nothing, and one day they'll be able simply to redress themselves and owe us nothing. And then they've invented something called fresh dollar accounts, and any money now that we receive from outside Lebanon in USD is a new kind of dollars. The other they have now called lollars, so Lebanese dollar. It's so absurd that, you know, I hear myself saying these things and I think, I'm not sure you believe the absurdity of what I'm saying, but Rima and Colin can confirm. We laugh about it because it's so, some of it is so painful, and
Yes.
and so you know, it can give birth to so much anger and bitterness inside of us. Sometimes the healthiest and most healing way of responding to it is by laughter.
Yes. Martin, one other question about what you said. Going back to the explosion in the Beirut port, am I right in thinking that everybody knows the main people who are responsible for that explosion? If they know who was responsible, why has no one been brought to justice?
Yeah, I'm not sure everyone knows who is responsible for the explosion, but anyone who really has eyes and ears and a brain to think is pretty sure who the ammonium nitrate belonged to. So these are two different things. So what is it that actually ignited the explosion is one thing, and that's a mystery, one could say, and there are various theories, from conspirational to simply banal technical mistake. But the ammonium nitrate, a large proportion of the Lebanese population is convinced belongs to or belonged to Hezbollah, and in fact was being used in the war in Syria, where there were barrel bombs that were being dropped. I mean, you listen to the testimony of any Syrian refugees, and the nightmare of barrel bombs has been the worst. And this is basically barrels with ammonium nitrate and pieces of metal, shrapnels. And in fact, experts also have now revealed that the amount of explosive that blew up in the port of Beirut was far less than the original amount that was deposited by that ship at the port. And it's not because only part of it exploded, but because only part of it was left there, remained. And so if all of it had been there, I don't know if I'd be here to tell the story.
Martin, can we go on to what Christians are doing to respond in that situation? And I'd like to ask you to tell us more about your own projects. Am I right in thinking, for example, that you're trying to do for Lebanon what the Truth and Reconciliation Committee did for South Africa under apartheid?
There's some parallel, some comparison. In fact, our project is called Truth and Reconciliation Lebanon, and we intentionally use that construct. But me and my colleagues are not legal experts, so it's not a tribunal setting, but we are using a historical approach in order to address the past from a multiple narrative perspective. And so we're taking single events from the Lebanese Civil War, and we are reconstructing narrative as a sort of archaeological reconstruction of events and of narratives. So it's not the events that are of interest to us, it's the way that an event is told by a community. And our whole philosophy of studying history is different from the common belief that we study history in order to learn the truth about what happened. Well, I believe that the truth, something did happen, but the truth is not accessible to human beings, not even to historians. And so we are, because every community, especially in a conflict history, tells the story of an event from its own perspective. So we're not so much interested in the truth of an event. We are interested in the way that events are told within a community, because regardless of its truth or lack of truth, that the way the story is told, so this narrative actually shapes a community's identity, and it shapes the way that a community interacts with another community. And so this is what we're interested in. And the purpose of studying history is therefore to cultivate in a new generation values like empathy and active listening, and the ability to accept that there are a multiplicity of narratives. Even if you disagree with what others believe, you can still listen to it. And the fact that in our own stories, we tend to be the victims and others tend to be the perpetrators of crime against us. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I've put myself on the AirPod. And so when you are able to hear that in the narrative of another community, they are the victim and you are the perpetrator, this can be the beginning of dialogue and the possibility of reconciliation.
Martin, another question about Christian responses to the situation. What are churches doing in relation to the Syrian refugees in the country?
When the Syrian refugee crisis began around 2014, the church many churches began to be very active, and I'm going to speak more for the evangelical church because I think that's probably the main angle of your question. So many evangelical churches started to be very active, to look at the needs around them and to respond. And we've been able to see from time to time the church in Lebanon respond appropriately in times of crisis and get out of its own self and begin to see needs and respond to them. So it has been very encouraging at times, the way that the church has responded. Now there's less interest in the Syrian crisis in the international community. I suspect you hear less about it in the news, and so the churches get less external funds in order to help Syrian refugees. So the churches are still trying to do as much as they can, but then compounded to that is the fact that it has become increasingly difficult for Lebanese families to survive in the current economic climate. I don't think I have ever seen the kind of poverty and difficulty to make ends meet within the church, within those who would have been at least middle class in the past, as I see today in society very close to us, among us, around us, and this has been very difficult to watch.
So, Martin, I think my last question needs to be, what are the ways in which we from outside the situation can help and support you? Obviously, we can pray. Is there advocacy that we can be involved in? What are the best ways for us to support you?
So obviously prayer and advocacy and moral support is extremely important to to feel that we are part of an international body that experiences both pain and encouragement with us. I'm going to do something which I very, very rarely do, which is I want to accentuate the financial crisis, and I want to encourage you in some practical ways. So I think, and it's not about so much about just the money, it's about finding ways for professionals to stay in the country, which I think is a crucial matter. Many are struggling financially to put bread on the table for their families. So, and I'm talking both outside the church, of course, but also inside the church. It's been really striking. Give to churches and organizations that you trust, who you know will support those who need it most. Teachers, nurses, doctors, workers in every sector need your financial support to survive. We have had there's a loss of people like I've never seen before, and I've only ever lived in Lebanon except for 5 years in my life when I was studying in the UK. Parents need financial support to keep their children in school. Although the support of refugees continues through UN bodies and other organizations, there's next to nothing that's done for Lebanese who are struggling. I would encourage you to seek ways to support Christians in our churches to survive financially. And I know this might sound terribly parochial, and it's not in my habit to advocate for my narrow community, but the situation is really desperate. If all Christians leave to look for economic opportunities, who will stay? Who will be salt and light? If you know individuals in churches in Lebanon, ask them how they are doing financially. Ask them what families they know that are struggling, and perhaps find ways to support them directly. You can make a huge difference in the life of one family, 3 families. Sometimes this is much more efficient than going through church structures or organizations. Most of us who are still able to function are supporting numerous others as best we can, but our capacities are very limited. I can't think of a more crucial time for global Christian solidarity in financial support. I've never felt the need so strongly all around me.
Thank you, Martin, very much. I'm sure you'll have lots more questions when we come to it in a few minutes' time. So I wonder if we can turn to Rima now. And Rima, as with Martin, let me ask you if you can tell us something of your own story first before you tell us something about Lebanon today.
Yes, good evening. So my name is Rima Nasrallah. I was born in Lebanon and raised in Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War, so in the 1970s. And I'm a member in a Protestant church, 4th generation, 5th generation, I think, in my family, in a Protestant community. I first studied electrical engineering at the American University of Beirut, and then did a Master's of Divinity at the Near East School of Theology, where I was privileged to have Reverend Colin Chapman as my teacher, I think in the years 2002, 2003, around that time. And we're still friends since then. I worked for a while at the Protestant church in downtown Beirut, my own church, as a director of the Department of Christian Education and Spiritual Life. And then with my husband, who is Dutch, we traveled to the Netherlands. I studied here in the Netherlands at the Free University, and then at the Protestant Theological University, where I had my PhD in liturgical studies. And then we went back to Lebanon as a family. And since then, I've been teaching at the Near East School of Theology, practical theology. So that's my field. And besides that, I'm an ordained minister at the Protestant church as well. So these are the 2 things that I'm busy with mostly. So that's roughly my story. So
Thank
far.
you. So Rima, I think you live in Ras Beirut. In fact, you live in the college. What's it like living there, and how would you describe the situation in Lebanon today? Martin has used the word desperate to describe the situation. Can you give us your perspective? Give us some idea of very practically what it means.
I have to say the past 4 years have been really, really bad. We've seen the decline in living conditions in a way, as Martin said, in unprecedented ways. For example, for a while we had no access to diesel. We didn't have, the government was not providing electricity at all, 0 hours of electricity. So we had to rely on private generators. And if you don't have diesel, you can't run your generator. Now the government is gracious enough to give us a couple of hours of electricity per day, but still we are heavily relying on private generators, which means we cannot cover the entire 24 hours of power necessary. At the nest, we've had moments when we were teaching with candlelight, or I gave an exam once where our students had to carry their phone and put on the flashlight on their phone so that they can see the exam questions and write down the answers. We had also, since there is no power provided by the government, water is not pumped into the homes. Because the government cannot pump water and provide us with water, so we have to buy water for everyday use, and it has become also very expensive, but the really need for water is very, very big. So we buy truckloads of water to supply our needs. You also spoke about the fact that we cannot withdraw money from the banks. This means that many families, their living standards has changed dramatically. And by living standards, I mean they can't even buy everyday necessary needs. So their savings are not accessible. So if they have worked all their life, put some money in the bank for the time of need, you can't access this money. People's salaries have depreciated, of course. So because we were getting salaries if they are in Lebanese lira, they're worth nothing. So people who had a salary of, say, $2,000 are living today on a $200 worth of salary, whereas the cost of living is still the same or even more sometimes. So products are imported in supermarkets, so they cost still the same amount of money, but what you get as your salary is so much less that you can't afford that. Another aspect of life, everyday life, that was affected is the educational system. I know from our church, for example, that many families had to remove their children from private schools. But the problem is that public schools have stopped functioning this year or functioned very little. So there were a lot of kids sitting at home trying to do the programs, their official exam programs, alone at home, teaching themselves. Because there is no access to education. And Lebanon has been, or was for a very long time, had excellent educational system, both schools and universities. And now we saw a great drop in the level. First, because many schools have closed down. Our schools, for our church, for example, we had to close some schools. We couldn't afford anymore to run them, and parents couldn't afford to pay the fees, and we couldn't pay the salaries of the teachers, so we had to close down schools. The second reason is that many teachers have emigrated because they're working for $100 a month. They couldn't live anymore in Lebanon, so they could find better jobs, better paying jobs in Dubai and Abu Dhabi and other places. And yeah, so this whole system has been damaged greatly. Also the health system, we lost many doctors and many nurses, as Martin said, but also people can't afford anymore. We don't have enough medications in the country, and an average family cannot afford to pay for the insurance, and the insurance is not covering all the expenses. A colleague of mine is undergoing an operation today, a medical operation, and it has been a nightmare trying to put together enough money for her to cover the costs of this operation. and she had to cut around the edges. I don't know how to say it, to try to minimize as much as possible what she can do in the operation so that she can afford it. And that's crazy. I mean, really, people are also not going to doctors anymore. You skip a dentist, you skip medical checkups. People try to solve things at the pharmacy instead of asking a doctor because they cannot afford it. So that's the kind of misery that you see in the country. Sadly, yeah. Also, a lot of, yeah. Sorry?
I was going to say, do you have a president and a functioning government at the moment?
Yes, that's a very good question. That's a very good question. We have been since October last year without a president. So we do not have a president, and we cannot agree on a president. And I don't know if there's a will to agree on a president. The parliament has to meet. They are not meeting. They're not, or they meet and then they dissolve their meeting very quickly before they come to an agreement. So we don't see any signs of hope that there will be a president anytime soon. The government is a demissionaire government, so it is only solving or meeting finishing some of the matters that were on the table already, but not coming up with new projects or new plans. And the parliament is not meeting. And the judges are off. So also our judiciary system is not working. And our very corrupt governor of the central bank also just finished his term. So we do not have a governor of the bank. So the banking system, the judiciary system, the parliament, the government, and the president are all missing or dysfunctional. Yeah. However, although we have a lot of poor people and a lot of things not functioning, we are also very surprised that we see a lot of people who have been enriched and are partying and are spending a lot of money and living lavishly. And we do not understand how this is possible, that the difference between poor and rich has become so great, that there are people who are becoming even richer in this situation.
Rima, we often talk about the church having a prophetic voice in any context. Are there any ways in which the churches are able to speak with a prophetic voice?
I have to also describe a little bit the fact that I think many of the Lebanese are experiencing a situation of lack of trust, in general, a lack of trust. We realize that we have been living in a fake situation. We see that there is no justice, as Martin has explained extensively. That I think a lot of people are living in a life with really no trust in anything or anyone or any future, and even, dare I say, in God. That God is in control, or that things can change, or that there's providence. And I think this is a place where the church feels we are called to reestablish some sort of trust, basic trust for people, that it's not all chaotic and nonsense, and that you can't rely on anybody. We also notice, as I said, because of this change in rich and poor, and that people feel in their everyday lives that you need to manage in any possible way. And since there is no justice, any means that you have are justified. So you can rob your neighbor. If you provide power with a private generator, you can put any price you want. Plumbers are asking for astronomical prices, pricing everything in dollars. So you feel as if the moral compass of the country also has broken down. And I see that every day, that it's morality. I mean, people don't know what is right and wrong. They don't feel that they need to abide by any right and wrong because it doesn't make sense anymore. And that is, again, another place where, as a church, I feel this is also our calling to remind each other that it is not okay that there is a right and wrong, that knowledge of good and bad, good and evil, is a very important dimension of being a human being and a Christian. So establishing basic trust and reminding people of their moral values, ethical values, I think are very, very important for our churches. Of course, helping people financially, relief, development, these are things that we've always done and we continue to do. But I think other NGOs can also do that. I mean, NGOs can do that. They're not all doing it well, but we're giving people this sense of meaning and trust and confidence and in God and in God's provision is very important. And another thing that we are also facing, and maybe also as Christians and as churches, is the fact that our institutions are collapsing. Old institutions that have been there, reliable. I just mentioned that our schools are closing. Many of our schools had to close down, or we're unable to keep them floating. And you see that in many of the institutions that have been carrying the community and the society, for example, homes for the elderly, they can't function anymore because of finances, because of human resources, because of the fact that there are people who have been working for such a long time under such difficult circumstances that I think many of us are burned out, completely and totally burned out. We cannot go on anymore. So home for the elderly, home for children with disabilities, the schools, clinics, you see that these institutions are collapsing or dragging or barely able to meet the needs. And you also see that, yeah, as Christians and as churches, we're trying to push, but it's very, very difficult for us to keep pushing.
Rima, on the question of support, let me ask you a very specific question. Many of the folk listening at the moment will be in the States. Does America have any interest in Lebanon? And if so, is there any way that American Christians and churches can lobby in Washington to get Lebanon on the agenda?
I think, I believe America always has some kind of interest in Lebanon. And we are not always sure what, in which direction it wants to lead us. So we were wondering, for example, when the banking system collapsed and the governor of the central bank was being investigated, we were wondering if America is, however we want to label this, America or American political interest, is going to protect him and keep him in place and get him out of trouble, or if they are going to facilitate that he will be brought to justice. So we would like if Americans could lobby for to push towards more transparency, but to push for justice to take place. In regard to the financial system in particular, because there's our whole banking system, the International Monetary Fund, all the discussion that is around that. Is it going to be pushed under the carpet, as Martin mentioned, because we know that everything is at the end, it's all becomes very blurred, and whatever investigation starts is lost, and we never really know at the end what happened to the facts. So we would really wish that international powers, not only America, international powers would put some more pressure on the Lebanese authorities to see this to the end, and that at one point we would actually see some justice, that people will understand what happened to their money and see the banks stand again and become functional again. We would also like that international powers would also put some pressure regarding the election of a president, but a new president, a neutral president, or a president who is capable of getting us out of this trouble, and not a president who is serving the interests of one block of the community over against the other. Particularly if it's a president who's coming from with war history involvement in our past, another corrupt man. So yeah, these are the things that we would wish for. We would wish that there would be more pressure for justice and for a good president.
Thank you, Rima. I'm sure you're going to get a lot more questions in a moment from the question and answer. So I'm going to hand over to Lauren now, because I'm sure that a lot of questions already have been appearing on screen.
Hello again. So one more quick reminder to use the Q&A if you have any questions, but we have some great questions already. The first questions are focused on the kind of financial side of things, as Martin discussed at the beginning. So on a very technical standpoint, someone asked, who are the financial partner nations who are kind of working with this crony structure that you're kind of discussing? And also, is the dollarization of the Lebanese currency a problem looking into the future for the Lebanese economy?
I see Rima is muted, so I'll venture a response. I'm not an economist, but being forced to think about these issues all the time makes you more able. The problem is the financial partners of Lebanon. I think that's a big part of the problem. One is really, I cannot understand, for instance, the lack of accountability of the Lebanese government vis-a-vis the international community, the World Bank, the IMF, organizations that have given so much money and governments that have given so much money to the Lebanese government and demanded no accountability, it seems. I mean, I work with a research center. I have a research center. We apply for grants. I mean, donors do not let us breathe with their demands of reports and of transparency and accountability. And I sometimes wonder what has happened in Lebanon. How have we fallen into so much debt, so much borrowing that has been so badly used? So little of all of this money that has created such a huge national debt in Lebanon has actually ended in productive development projects or infrastructure. We are a country more than 30 years after a civil war, and we've never had 24 hours of electricity over the past 33 years. And now we have less electricity than ever. We have 1 or 2 hours every 24 from the government. And so the Lebanese society has learned to rely on itself, to rely on individual initiatives. We have neighborhood generators. We buy water, whether it's for daily use or for drinking. So it's really baffling. I personally, people sometimes say, particularly, of course, our political classes, the international community is not helping us. They have abandoned us. Well, I'm really glad that the international community has abandoned us from a financial perspective, because every penny that the international community gives to our Lebanese political system basically is stolen and is accumulated debt over our children and grandchildren. So I'm happy that the international community has given up on the corrupt political class. And I think that individual initiatives, citizen to citizen, reaching out and supporting is, I think, much more effective than these large government grants and all of that. The dollarization of the economy, well, Lebanon's economy has been dollarized since the end of the civil war, so since the early 90s. And that is a big part of the problem that has led to where we are today. It's been one big scam. Every policy that the central bank has used, from the pegging of the Lebanese pound to the US dollar, to the huge interest on savings that they have given in order to attract foreign, not foreign investment, but in order simply to attract dollars that they can inject into the economy to maintain the system, has, that has been a policy that has completely killed any kind of interest in proper investment into real businesses, real industry, and to grow, to have really a homegrown economy. It's been a very artificial economy based on simply the dollarization. And so that definitely continues to have a very negative effect, and Lebanon needs a complete overhaul of its economic and banking and financial system.
Thank you. That was a great answer. Rima, do you have anything you'd like to say on this? Okay. Okay.
I think Martin said it all. Yeah.
I think that was very well said. And when you're then discussing, I liked kind of what you said of, I'm glad that the international forces sort of stepped out a little bit so that we can really see what's happening in Lebanon. Obviously, it's very painful what's happening in Lebanon. My question to you both is, do you have any hope in external forces coming in and helping and playing a role in putting Lebanon back on track? Or do you see that being an entirely internal process?
I think the word hope is a bit we are at a very decisive junction in the history of Lebanon. I don't know if things should get even worse so that they can get better, but something very dramatic has to happen. And I'm not sure if we can solve it. I mean, maybe this is terrible to say, but as a theologian, as a pastor, I'm starting to see our role is just do what we can in the little circles that we have, but I don't see how the big picture is going to change. There is so much at stake and so many complications, and the different groups are becoming more and more polarized. That coming to a solution, I don't know what Martin would think, but I'm very, very tired of trying to think of what could be the solution. That I have given up thinking what could be the solution. Internally, we have issues. We have lots of issues. I don't know if an external power can change that. I'm not sure. Martin, what do you think?
I've learned over the past few years to differentiate or distinguish between helplessness and hopelessness, because as a follower of Jesus, I cannot allow myself to say that I'm hopeless, because hope is or faith is hope in the unseen, and we are able to see and to live something that is beyond what we see and what we touch around us. And I'm not just speaking eschatologically, but I'm saying, our values are different. We try to have our hearts attached to things that go beyond the material. And so it's not this, I don't think I would say that I feel hopeless, but I certainly feel helpless. And I feel that it's so difficult to find ways to make a significant contribution to the current situation. And so I'm at the lowest point of where I've ever been in terms of feeling that I can contribute change. And I've come to the point where I do not do things anymore because I think this is gonna completely change things. I do things because I'm convinced that they are the right thing to do. And I also came to a realization of that one time when I was thinking, what is success from a biblical or Christ perspective? and how did Jesus measure success? And it came almost like an aha moment for me that it's not about the output, it's not about the outcome, because in fact, as we know, Jesus's life on earth was a terrible failure from a human perspective. The ending in death, the crucifixion, and not many had access to the resurrection. And so from a human perspective, it was a terrible failure. And so Jesus, from a human perspective in his lifetime, did not see any success of his mission. It was a terrible failure. It would have been extremely discouraging from a human perspective. But we all the time we see that Jesus is driven. His drive is not, oh, I'm going to do great things, I'm going to change the world. Jesus's drive is, I'm doing the work of my Father. And I think this is incredibly powerful. When I came to the realization of that, I began to measure success and doing the right thing differently from the outcome, and more, is this the right thing to do at this point in this very situation? And so both Rima and myself are very involved in a lot of things. Speaking for myself, the work that, leaving ABTS in 19 years of a stable job at the worst economic time in Lebanon was not a very wise or smart thing to do from a human perspective or strategy. But I just felt this incredibly strong draw to be more involved where the action is happening among political and social activists. So I've talked, when Colin asked me, I talked a little bit about the multiple narrative approach to history. But another area that I'm working on is simply working with political activists from the change movement. And we have regular meetings, and we are already preparing for the next general elections and working through a change, using change theory of social movements in the hope that we can do something. Now, do I think that it's going to have bear fruit? If I'm going to be honest, not very much anymore. But I feel that this is something that needs to be done, and the result has to be left to God.
That was very profound. I have loved hearing you speak already. I did want to touch on something that this sort of brought up, and also a question that was asked. I'm from the Midwest, in the middle of the US. My understanding of the Middle East for most of my life was that any overlap between Muslims and Christians throughout the Middle East is incredibly hostile. And now that I live in Jerusalem, I've learned that that's not always the case. And I'm really interested to know, from both of your perspectives, how the lives of Christians are overlapping or interlinking with the lives of Muslims in Beirut and across Lebanon.
Go, Rima.
That's your area, Christian-Muslim relations.
Both.
Yeah, I think, Lauren, of course, your impression from living and experiencing things in Palestine is also true for Lebanon. It's not always so clear. Although in Lebanon, we do have a history of separating regions and separating trends. Some things are more supported by Muslims and some more by Christians. And every now and then there is a spark, like last week we had a little spark over an incident where Christian and Muslim lines are becoming clearer. But I would say also living in Ras Beirut, when you're living in Ras Beirut, Christians and Muslims are living together. They go to the same schools, they go to the same hospitals, they participate in the same common spaces, and you don't feel it so much. So sometimes you feel the differences when it comes to politics and to certain positions, like regarding, I don't know, movies that are playing in the theater or something, that you start suddenly finding division in the groups. But we're not as hostile to each other as it is portrayed in the media, if this is what you're asking. And there are a lot of spaces where dialogue is possible, and a lot of initiatives that are bringing groups together. And yeah. That's what I would say.
Absolutely. And that was a great punt over to you, Martin, to talk about one of those initiatives that is bringing these people together, which is some of the research that you're doing as well.
Yeah, well, in terms of official interfaith dialogue, there's probably more happens in Lebanon than in any other country in the region, and has been happening since the 90s. So Lebanon has been a pioneer when it comes to the demonstration of the possibility of Christian-Muslim relations. And I have been involved for 19 years in this capacity, involved in all sorts of dialogue. But to be honest, I got tired of it, and that's also one of the pushes that pushed me more into working with young people who are seeking sociopolitical change. I found that that faith leaders, and this may come across a little bit harsh, but I find that faith leaders are not very courageous quite often. The hierarchy and structure of religious institutions prevents local religious leaders from actually being courageous and doing new things in an innovative way. Those who do often get ostracized by their own religious institution. We have many examples in our history. And in some ways, the head of sects, the patriarch or the mufti or the bishops, they want to control, they want to centralize into action, and they don't want their people to get involved in politics, but every sermon they preach is all about politics. So I've tried a lot with faith leaders to see, to arouse them and say, let's hold politicians accountable rather than allowing politicians to abuse religion to their own ends. But I haven't been successful, to be honest. So on the other hand, there's the day-to-day level, the lived interfaith. And so Rima mentioned that she lives and works in Ras Beirut, or on the western side of Beirut. I live in that part of Beirut as well. In fact, my wife and I made that decision quite consciously to put our kids in a school in the Muslim majority side of Beirut and to live there ourselves, because we didn't want our children to grow up in Christian ghetto, because I think that's one of our main problems in this country. So day to day, most of my kids' friends are Muslim or Druze. Many of their parents are friends of ours. And so the day-to-day lived experience is very positive. It's the leaders that need to get, how do you say, get on the program.
Yeah,
with
absolutely.
Good relations. Yeah.
In that same vein, we see this trend in many countries across the Middle East of Christian organizations often running or helping run some public infrastructure. So running some big hospitals or having schools open for serving Muslim and Christian students. How is this infrastructure looking right now in the midst of this economic crisis in Lebanon? Are you seeing these schools close over the last 10 years? Are you seeing this infrastructure still alive and well?
I would I mentioned that a while ago in my talk, that yes, I see many, especially of the traditional, the all-time schools and clinics and home for the elderly, many of them suffering greatly and closing down. So we do have schools closing down, loads of Christian schools closing down, and hospitals suffering, and so on. There are new initiatives on the other hand. So there are small initiatives funded by churches from abroad, maybe, or other groups that pop out to serve the Syrian refugees or to serve certain smaller groups. But these are short-term projects. The long-term historical institutions are really, really in a desperate situation.
Thank you for replying to that. I think it's important because a few questions have asked And obviously, we're talking about the different role that international Christians can play in assisting, especially right now in the midst of the economic crisis. And Embrace the Middle East, who's one of our core co-sponsors for this event, do a lot of work in giving to partners who are working very, very heavily with poverty and injustice throughout the Middle East, but they have many partnerships in Lebanon. And they have an expert team who are looking at different partners and realizing exactly where the money is. Smaller Christian projects that are running in Lebanon, they are a very wonderful resource to use. I've put their link in the chat. I'll do that again. But their team is so wonderful at what they do. And if you're interested in knowing exactly where your money is going, they're happy to discuss those things with you. So that's just a great resource that I think Christians from the UK and the US can engage with. But I know that Rima mentioned it in passing earlier. I didn't say it at the beginning. But Reverend Chapman lived in Lebanon for a while, was Rima's teacher. Rima and Martin have both interacted heavily with Colin. Colin, I'm wondering if you can come back. I'm not going to put you on the spot to share about your experiences necessary in Lebanon, but I'm just wondering if you have some kind of closing questions, summarizing everything that we've talked about today, and maybe pulling in a little bit of your time or your experiences from Lebanon.
Thank you, Lauren. To be honest, I feel speechless after listening to Rima and Martin. My wife and I visited Beirut in February and March this year, and we saw something of the situation. But I think what we've heard from Rima and Martin tonight is really, really powerful. And I'm so impressed that they have been so honest in describing the situation. I noticed that Martin has used the word desperate, and probably Rima used it as well, probably more than once. And I think all of us listening from outside have heard that message. But we've also heard something about hope, and I really don't feel in a position to make any tying up comments at the end, because I think Rima's and Martin's contributions have been so powerful. It's so important always that we hear from people inside the situation, and that we don't listen to people on the sidelines who are shouting. And that's why I simply want to go and reflect on what they said. I've noticed from what they've said and what I've seen myself that in some ways the situation today is much, much worse than the civil war that I and my family lived through for some years earlier. Several people have told me that the situation is even worse than it was during the Civil War. And I think it's really important that all of us who are watching this evening are aware of how difficult, and again, to use that word, desperate, the situation is. And I just hope that CMEP and Embrace will be able to think of very, very specific ways in which they can respond to the suggestions that Rima and Martin have made this evening.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate those sort of slight closing words. I'm wondering, Rima or Martin, if either of you would like to say anything. Or I see, if you guys didn't see, someone asked about the research that Dr. Cott has done, and he posted some of those answers in the Q&A feature. So if you'd like to look into some of the work he has written around this multi-narrative research, that's a great resource and tool. But as we're closing, maybe, a kind of a closing word, and I appreciate all that you've said about helplessness versus hopelessness. And as you know, we have 80 people gathered from the US and the UK who I'm sure have learned so much about Lebanon and the Christian community that's living there and the work that you're doing. A closing word to our audience tonight.
I'll start. So one of the things I want to actually add something about Embrace, and they haven't paid me to say this. I haven't worked directly with Embrace, but I've met a few of their leaders. But my wife, who works with an organization here called Tahaddi, someone asked, how is Tahaddi, in the Q&A as well. So that might be a bit of an answer to that. And Tahaddi is an organization that works in one of the poorest neighborhoods of Beirut and does health and education and community work and all of that. And I know that for my wife, who has worked with them for 15 years, she often tells me that one of the partners she most appreciates are Embrace. I say that because the reason for her feeling that is because she feels that they are there to observe, to listen, to learn. They're not coming, to tell you what your problem is. They're coming to listen to the realities on the ground and to learn, really, and they take it in. And so in a way, that's not so much a shout out for Embrace, but I think maybe to encourage us to have this attitude. And it's not because Rima and I understand these things better than all of you, but because I'm fairly ignorant about Ukraine, for instance, but we live here. But the ability to, as a listener, as an observer, is so important. And so I would encourage you to continue. I mean, you are here for a reason tonight, because you are wanting to listen and learn. So thank you so much for being here for that. And maybe just a closing comment on what Colin said. During the Civil War, we had we were daily in mortal danger. I wouldn't say that we are daily in mortal danger today in Lebanon. And so in that sense, I think I would not swap today for this.
Martin, we
I'm
lost
sorry.
you. We lost you when you were
Yeah.
saying we were in mortal danger. We're not in mortal danger every day. And then
Okay. Yeah. So I wouldn't swap today for another civil war. But it's a very different kind of desperate situation where certainly we have a role as church to give hope to people around us, to understand the impact that we can have individually in the lives of individuals. And I would say, and that's why I've been so focused on, there are so many families that need support in this country today, like I've never seen it before. And in a way, this kind of solidarity is the way that the global body of Christ can also stand by. Let's not think, we want to help 4 million people. Let's think, if I can make a small change in the life of one family, 2 families, you would have made an incredible impact in Lebanon. And the more people are willing to do that, and the more people will have their hope restored and will be able also to support others around them in this desperate situation.
Yeah, I think I'll add my voice to Martin and say it's great to see that there's so much interest in whatever is happening in our little country. We don't have one enemy that is against us. We're not fighting one enemy, and somehow we deserve what is happening to us as Lebanese people. I'm ashamed and embarrassed to say this. but somehow it's something went wrong in the fabric of the country and the people, and we got ourselves into this problem. And so I'm very happy that there are people like you interested in what is happening with us and encouraging us in our struggles. One of the things that I find, one of the verses from scripture that also encourages me at this point is from Romans 5, that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame. And I think one of the challenges we are facing in Lebanon is the bit about the character, because sometimes suffering can also break the character. And so as Christians in the Middle East, one of the challenges we are having is that our character, Christian character, really comes out, and that we don't, find ourselves embracing a character that we do not want to embrace, in the way we handle things and see things and perceive things, and that eventually will produce the hope that we are looking for, the hope in Christ. So that's what I would say at the end.
What a deeply profound session. I can't thank you both enough. This was so powerful and so moving. So thank you very much for sharing. I am going to post this comment. It just says that, again, referring you to Embrace's page. And if you'd like to advocate with your home government, that's what Churches for Middle East Peace really specializes. So we would love to help you with advocacy tools and more resources regarding what's happening in Lebanon. Can I just say thank you one final time to Reverend Colin Chapman for all of the work that he has done facilitating this series. What an absolute treasure to have you on board. And thank you to all who have joined us for all 4 sessions, and for all those who are joining us for the first time this session. It was quite the session to attend. So thank you very much. It has been an absolute pleasure. And with that, we are going to end the call. So thank you very much.